And I'm going to use this opportunity to introduce myself. I am Mayra Oyola from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I also work as the Deputy Director for the International GNSS Service. And it is my honor to introduce Dr. Anna Riddell, who will be our speaker today. Anna Riddell is a geodesist at Geoscience Australia, where she enjoys understanding all of the wiggly movements of the Earth as it changes size and shape in response to the distribution of mass within and upon its surface. Anna graduated with honors from the University of Tasmania with a bachelor's degree in surveying and spatial sciences in 2011, before securing a graduate placement at GA. Anna then returned to UT to complete her PhD in 2021 on the vertical motion of the Australian plate using the National GNSS Course Network. Anna's team at GA is responsible for defining and maintaining the Australian Geospatial Reference System, including the Geocentric Datum of Australia, the Australian Height Datum, and the Australian Vertical Working Surface. Anna will be presenting today on vertical land motion of Australia from GNSS and geophysical models. So without any further ado, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thank you everyone for joining today. I realise that the time zones may not be particularly conducive, but hopefully those tuning into the recording can also enjoy. Thanks to the AGU Geodesy section for putting on this webinar series. It's a great opportunity for me to take you through a bit of a wander through some of my PhD research, but then also some of the work that we're doing at Geoscience Australia, particularly around height reference systems. So I'm going to start with a question about, apologies, there we go, I can't get my slides to move forward, about, it seems that Australia could be sinking, but we don't necessarily know why. So I'm going to talk about some of the present day crustal motion, as well as some of the work that we do at GA, understanding continental scale deformation. And so we live on a very dynamic planet where there are many processes that happen over millennial to decadal scales that change the way the surface and the subsurface of the Earth looks and how it feels, and I guess it wiggles. And so to mention a few from the diagram here, we know that plate tectonics and earthquakes will reshape the surface, but we also observe much subtler movements from mass changes such as movements of ice at the poles with the changing of the seasons, and also there's human-induced effects that come into that as well. And we can observe all of these changes using seismic, geodetic, and other techniques, as well as modelling approaches, to inform our understanding of how the change or deformation of the Earth's surface occurs over time. So over recent decades, horizontal sight velocities from space geodetic techniques such as GPS have been used to study plate tectonic kinematics in both global and regional settings. And more recently, there's been a bit more attention paid to the vertical velocities to, for example, to help determine absolute sea level at tie gauge sites. And so to assess the response of the Earth's surface to previous ice loading and also to monitor transient and ongoing deformation that's caused by earthquakes, to be able to make these observations at that sub-millimeter level, we rely on having a stable and accurate reference frame. Now, our knowledge of the upper properties of the Earth's crust, including the modern day stress fields, help inform our decision making. And that's with the implications across societal, scientific, and economic domains. And so the present day geology and geomorphology that cause deformation of the Earth's crust are controlled in parts by the stress fields and the crustal dynamics that can be better interpreted to understand the when, where, and how of earthquake events. And I'll move on to that a little bit later. And this also helps inform our understanding of the solid Earth deformation, and if we're interested in that part. Geodetic point positioning techniques like GPS can be used in terms of time series and the change over time at a collection of sites, which we have very fortunately in Australia, a large network that we're able to pull on. And then looking at that in 3 dimensions plus time, we're able to get a series of deformation that offers an important insight into how the crust has evolved in the present day, and then also starting to make predictions forward or backwards. And so that's where I'd like to start today, I guess, is the big picture context is very much around understanding global sea level change, where that remains one of the most important indicators of climate change. And in Australia, our economic, social and cultural identity is very strongly tied to the coast, where we have about 85% of our population living within 50 kilometres of the coastline. And we host a large amount of our critical infrastructure, whether that's transport, energy, commercial, defence, as well as residential dwellings along the coastline, and they are vulnerable to changes in sea level and also the occurrence of extreme events. And we know that global sea level is the topic of considerable research, with billions upon billions of dollars invested globally towards understanding those coastal impacts, as well as adaptation and mitigation. And so I guess that's one of the big picture settings for why I chose to do my research on vertical land motion, and it particularly tied to at those coastal regions. So here we have a picture of some beach erosion on the Gold Coast in Queensland, which is along the east coast of Australia, slightly down further south in New South Wales, in Woy Woy. You can see that there's a wharf underwater, but the locals have just adapted to that and fish anyway. But then we also have our Pacific Island neighbouring countries that are suffering severe washover events or sea level changes in those areas where critical infrastructure, such as the airport. So this is a picture of Majura and the Marshall Islands, where they do often get washover events across their airport. And so we're starting to see that this is not just a 1 in 100 year occurrence or an infrequent occurrence. It's starting to occur quite regularly. And so we can use GNSS to assess vertical land motion. And that's where I started my research, was trying to understand, could we use a network of sites across Australia, both coastal and inland, to understand the entire continental change, understanding that most of our tide gauge record of sea level change will need some correction for vertical land motion, even though you might have a combination of techniques of satellite altimetry as well as GNSS and traditional tide gauge observations. It's still important to understand that there are crustal influences that can change the height of the tide gauge that's measuring the sea level in that area. And so the idea that the measurement of sea level by traditional techniques can be complicated is not new, but I hope to try and work with that. And what I was also interested in are the non-linear deformations. So not necessarily fitting a straight line and fitting that over time and considering that to be the long-term change. I wanted to understand if there were short-term crustal dynamics and short-term variability that need to be taken into account. Noting that a lot of the work that we do does fit a straight line and make that assumption that that is the long-term trend. And so part of this was then also trying to dig down into the data and understand if we could look at the main drivers for that vertical land motion. So not only measuring it and observing it, but trying to understand the causes of that land motion in Australia, which is more complicated than you might think. And so I wanted to just touch briefly on the concept of noise. This is making an assumption that most of the audience are familiar with the concept of noise in time series data, but essentially, for me, that's about breaking the time series or the data down into chunks, and so, or components, if you like. So there's a trend, there may well be offsets or breaks in the data series, and then there's also some seasonal signals as well as noise that is a component of that. And white noise is a common assumption when we're fitting a linear regression to get the long-term trend or the velocity of a particular set of data. But what we're seeing more and more often is that that assumption of white noise is no longer valid for geodetic time series, where we know that the observations are correlated over time. And so that there's, it's more common for a coloured noise or a power law or a flicker noise model to be added to that data to get a more realistic uncertainty estimate on those trends or the velocities. In Australia, we sit on quite a large tectonic plate known as the Indo-Pacific or the Australasian Pacific plate. And that movement is quite well known horizontally. So we know that that plate moves to the north-northeast at about 7 centimeters a year as it subducts under the Pacific plate towards the north. And this measurement is well constrained by GNSS, VLBI and SLR, as well as other seismic studies. So that motion for the horizontal movement is quite well known. And it is considered, this plate, to be one of the most internally stable crustal plates, excluding a small part in the southeastern region, where a recent study demonstrated that the large portion of the plate is deforming horizontally at less than 0.2 of a millimeter per year. So that assumption that it's fairly stable is pretty good. But in contrast to understanding the vertical land motion or the vertical velocity of the crustal plate, that's relatively unknown. And we do see inconsistencies between modeled vertical land motion and also observed vertical land motion. A previous research indicates that the vertical velocity or the vertical motion from GPS of the Australian continent is between 0 and -1 millimeter per year. And so that suggests that there's a sinking or a subsidence motion. And across Australia, recent modelled predictions of ongoing surface deformation, particularly due to glacial isostatic adjustment, being the response of the solid Earth to past ice and ocean loading changes, are ambiguous. But most of the movement from those GIA models are in the positive to that 0.5 millimeter per year level over the Australian landmass. And so we're going to take a look at some of the comparisons between those observations of land motion and the modelled vertical land motion. And so that idea of the vertical part is still a little bit unknown, is what led me to undertake most of my research. Understanding the seismic setting is also important. So I've talked a little bit about crustal deformation, and earthquake deformation is certainly one of the causes in our area. So we have contemporary crustal stress fields, which are broadly controlled by tectonic forces. And the Indo-Australian plate has a very complex plate boundary where we see all different types of transform compression edges as that cause the faults internally to rearrange to relieve some of the accumulated strain towards the center of the plate. And we do see some distinct seismic zones. So you'll see one over to the west, kind of in southern Western Australia. We see another seismic zone around central southern Australia, and then also that southeastern seismic zone. And all of these are little chattery earthquakes. They're not very large at all. So this is a map of the events in 1 year across 2019 that were more than magnitude 3. And so we also see a lot of smaller earthquakes, but they're routinely, I guess, not monitored. But we do see the occasional larger intraplate earthquake. And so what I'm calling that is more than a magnitude 6. And we have had a few of those in the recent years. And then also, of course, the larger plate boundary earthquakes that happen around the Sumatra, Banda Aceh areas that we know have been quite disastrous in the past. And in recent decades, GNSS time series have been used to quantify some of the crustal deformation and also to constrain some of the earthquake models. And I'll go into that a little bit further as well. So how did I start? I guess is the first question. And we've got this beautiful network of GNSS continuously operating reference sites across Australia. And that's where I started. We've got this gorgeous network that has been installed continuously, I guess, since 2007, where most of these sites came to maturity and we're collecting reliable data from 2013 onwards. And so the time series is mature enough at all of these sites to be able to start making some really great insights into what can we see in terms of crustal motion from GNSS across Australia. And I guess that was the main driver, was noting that nobody had looked at the entire network yet, particularly from a vertical point of view. And that's what I wanted to do, was to take this lovely network of GNSS sites and interrogate the data that was coming out. So the red sites that you can see there are our Australian regional GNSS network that have been operating for more than 20 years. And then the blue dots have been infilled since 2007, and they're the newer site builds. All of these sites are on a concrete pillar monumentation with a GNSS choke bin antenna. Power at the sites is variable depending on their location. Some are connected to mains power, others don't have that available in the locality, so they run off a solar with battery backup. Each of the sites have a little shed, as well as storage for the receiver and the batteries as needed. And then the communications also varies between the different sites as well, whether they are satellite communications or connected by internet. And so all of that data from those sites gets streamed back to GA and housed in our data archive, and is freely available for anybody that wishes to access that. And so this new AusScope network presents a fairly unique opportunity to assess regional and continental scale surface deformation using some fairly advanced analytical approaches across this, what I'm calling a fairly dense spatial network in Australia, but most of these sites are separated by between, I guess, 50 to 200 kilometres. So it's not dense in the sense that there's a site every kilometre or two, but it's dense in terms of the coverage that we have access to across Australia. And we are diving down to the sub-millimetre level. So I just wanted to highlight that in this work, a millimetre does matter. So where we're looking at trying to infer sea level change at the millimetre level, and then crustal movement that might be at the sub-millimetre level, it's important that the data analytics lives up to that, I guess, or that the certainty in our data and any bias in that is quantified. And of course, to begin all of this work, we need an accurate and reliable spatial reference frame. For without that, none of these measurements are comparable and none of these measurements are possible. And particularly as we're moving into an age where we're starting to see industries that are looking at the millimetre level as well. And so we're thinking about driverless cars here, or automated equipment, and particularly in precision agriculture in Australia, we're starting to see that call for centimetre accuracy, not necessarily millimetre yet, but I'm sure they'll get there. And so this is essentially highlighting that the datum matters and the reference frame matters. If you get that wrong, I guess you're going to see a few complications, hopefully not a tractor chasing you around the paddock, but complications nonetheless. And so that leads me to touch a little bit on the work that we've been doing in Australia around our geospatial reference system. And so this hinges off ITRF, clearly, where we have our regular, I guess, traditional static datum, being the modern one is GDA 2020, which is our geocentric datum, which is static, linked to ITRF, but epoched at the 1st of January 2020. And then we also have a time-dependent datum that is accessible to our users in terms of the Australian terrestrial reference frame. And you can move between the static datum and the time-dependent datum with a plate motion model. But that plate motion model does not take changes in height to account. So it is, although we describe it as a 3D model, the height change between the two is set to 0. And that's where some of this deformation modeling and the vertical component comes into, my work can lead into improving our geospatial reference system. And then, of course, we have our Australian height datum, which is our legal datum representing mean sea level across Australia. We've got AusGeoid to link between GDA 2020 and AHD. But due to a recent users survey, we discovered that not all users or applications, I guess the accuracy requirements of those applications are not met by AHD, noting that that's got an inherent systematic uncertainty of at around 9 to 13 centimetres, and that was starting to not be fit for purpose for some of our users. And so we've introduced the Australian Vertical Working Surface, which is a directly accessible vertical working surface that can be accessed without the need to occupy physical height infrastructure like a benchmark, which is what you need to do to access AHD across Australia. And we have a couple of geoid models that sit behind that that we're continuously working on improving. So that's a snapshot, I guess, of our reference system. We have a lot of tools available online for our users that enable the transformations and conversions to get between our different datums and the models. We have that brilliant cause infrastructure that sits behind, that underpins our datum. And we also have the models that describe the spatial, I guess, the geophysical processes that can affect the spatial measurements. And behind all of that, we have standards and people that are continuously working to improve our reference system so that we can get down to that millimetric level of measurement and observation. So let's start with a question. And that is very much at looking at if we've got this beautiful spatial reference system or spatial frame that we're working in, how much do we trust that? And what is the uncertainty that perhaps can creep in from our reference frame into our observations of crustal deformation? And so we're going to start with a bit of a journey to the center of the Earth, where we're trying to understand the movement of the geocenter, which is the origin of our reference frame. But unfortunately, unlike Jules Verne, we're not going to be finding giant man-eating flowers or dinosaurs on this trip. It'll just be a simple diagrammatic explanation. So to start with the center of mass, let's start with a uniform object like a cannonball, where the mass is equally distributed and the center of mass is going to be in the geometric center of that shape. Alternatively, if you take a non-uniform object like a pineapple, where there's an odd distribution of mass across the geometric shape of it, the center of mass is not going to be coincident with the geometric center of that shape. And so we're starting to see differences in the definition of what is the middle or what is the center point of these shapes. And it's the same for our Earth. As mass shifts across the surface and the subsurface of Earth, we see a change in the geocenter as that mass shifts around. So if you were to take an extremely heavy cyclist cycling across the surface of the Earth, you'll see that the geocenter, the center of mass, also shifts. And we can observe these changes in the geocenter by the changes in the orbits of the satellites that are orbiting around the center of mass. And we can also model these from surface mass transport models. And so to jump into a quick definition of some of the terminology around geocenter or geocenter motion, we have the center of mass of the total Earth, which includes the fluid envelope. So that's the oceans and the tides and any other fluids or masses on our Earth's surface. We have a center of network, which is generally a network of observation sites on the surface of the Earth. And so the center of figure and the center of network tend to be coincident, but can be slightly different if the network is unequally distributed across the surface of the shape that you're observing, in this point our Earth. And then the geocenter motion tends to be the difference between the center of mass and the center of network or the center of figure. And this is observed by satellite laser ranging and also modeled by surface mass transport. And as the fluid envelope changes, the center of mass will change, and we can measure the difference between those. For our International Terrestrial Reference Frame, or ITRF, we define that there are 0 translations and rates between the long-term laser ranging mean and the origin point of ITRF 2020. And we consider that to be representative of the motion between the center of mass with respect to the center of figure. And so where we're using a geodetic technique like GPS, which is in an Earth-centered, Earth-fixed system where the origin is defined by convention as the center of mass, or the geocenter being the origin point of ITRF 2014 at the moment and about to move to 2020. But this also means that any uncertainty in the geocenter will propagate into coordinate estimates from GNSS. And the current assumption, I guess, of that long-term motion of the geocenter from as observed by SLR is that it's a white noise only model and that there are no temporal correlations between the observation points, which we're starting to see is not necessarily a valid assumption any longer. So I wanted to test that. What does our geocenter motion series look like if we were to not hold that assumption any longer of a white noise and a linear trend? So I took the SLR residuals with respect to the ITRF 2014 origin, recognizing that there is quite a lot of noise in the early part of the series. I only took the time series from 1993 onwards and wanted to understand if there were geophysical reasons for some of the non-linearities that we see in the time series, or if it was a systematic change that could be improved for future realizations of ITRF. And so taking a really quick look, and you can see that there are some non-linearities present, and I wanted to investigate where they come from and if we can attribute those to geophysics. And so the way that I did that was by taking a look at some surface mass transport models, and I used two different ones with slightly different constructions. The first one is a combination of mass changes from steric sea level rise, contributions from ice sheets across Greenland and Antarctica, glacial isostatic adjustment, changes in hydrology, as well as changes in land glaciers, and of course, oceanic and atmospheric pressure changes as well. And so the majority of this model is from a GRACE data set, as well as altimetry data, and it's an inverted approach that solves for the sea level equation. And so because it's a GRACE model, the data only goes from 2002 to 2014, which is not ideal for comparison with the SLR, which is why I wanted to introduce the second model. And so this one's another surface mass transport model, and it's a combination of numerical techniques that also solves the sea level equation to conserve mass for the global system after taking into account some self-attraction and loading effects using fingerprinting to represent the non-uniform redistribution of water. And this was a model from TU Delft. And so the data is the full span of the SLR series, but it ignores trends. And between these two surface mass transport models, GIA is treated slightly inconsistently. And so these are all things that we're taking into account when we do the comparison. And so taking a look at the comparison of the SLR residuals with respect to the ITRF 2014 origin, that the models appear similar provides confidence in their construction, even though there were some differences in the components that go into those. But immediately what we're able to see is that neither of those mass transport models explain the large amount of variability from the SLR. And so we're seeing quite a significant difference in the magnitude of those signals. But there's also a low frequency difference in there as well. But the fact that there's a very clear linear signal in the mass transport models suggests that there's a non-geophysical source for the non-linearities in the satellite laser ranging translations. And so we took a few other steps to try and understand those, looking at the colored noise in the satellite laser ranging translations. And we're able to understand that by putting a colored noise model in instead of a white noise model to assist with estimating the trend and the uncertainty, we saw a 5-fold increase in the trend uncertainty compared to a white noise only model. So that's suggesting that there is a large amount of colored noise in there that's not being taken into account at the moment. And so that's in a paper. I'm happy to take questions of that at the end. That was the first paper that came out of my PhD research. So the next question that I wanted to look at, now that we've looked at our reference frame and understood some of the, I guess, the influences that has and the considerations that we need to take into account when we're making observations, can we then bring it up to the surface of the Earth and understand what's going on at the Australian continental scale and whether there's any present day motion that we can understand, break down, and perhaps find some of the driving mechanisms for that vertical land motion. So the first question, well, what is the vertical land motion across Australia? Does it have a spatial pattern? Are there certain timescales that fits to in the present day? So we're talking about very modern day, present day motion here. And can we pick out any of the dominant driving mechanisms? What causes that vertical land motion? across Australia. So this is going back to our GNSS cores network, where we've got a good set of data. We're looking across temporal, spatial, and spectral domains to try and understand those motions. I guess one of the comparisons that I wanted to take a look at initially was that inconsistency between the observed vertical land motion and then also the modelled vertical land motion, specifically from glacial isostatic adjustment, noting that that signal across Australia is quite small, almost negligible, less than 0.5 millimetre per year is the rate that the models are suggesting. And so I just wanted to demonstrate the importance of why we do correct for GIA. And this is from Woppelman and Marcus 2016, where we're just going to focus on the time series from Sweden, which is this bottom panel here, where there's quite a significant a drop in mean sea level at the rate of about, I think it's about 6 millimetres per year, which is a fairly significant sea level fall if you're just looking purely at the tide gauge data. By the time you correct for GIA, that signal changes completely. It almost reverses its sign and is now at the plus 0.7 millimetres per year, purely from a GIA correction of that tide gauge sea level record. And then if you're taking into consideration other vertical land motions, so this is now the GPS corrected annual mean sea level record, we now have a mean sea level change that's in the positive, where initially if you were to just take the tide gauge record, you would have thought that sea level was falling, but once you've done the corrections for the vertical land motion, you see that there's actually a fairly significant sea level increase per year. And that demonstrates the importance of why we need to account for vertical land motion at some of our tide gauge sites. And so I guess if you were to take a singulistic comparison of GPS and GIA in terms of the vertical velocities that were input into ITRF 2014, across Australia, we do see this subsidence signal between 0 and -1 millimetres per year. And so that was kind of the prompter for me to consider this as a question, was taking a look at ITRF, what the vertical velocities were there, and then could we densify that across our region. And so I did that by reprocessing the entire AuScope GNSS network as a PPP solution, taking into account a whole host of, I guess, further advanced analytical models, and that's all detailed in some of my papers. And then I wanted to look at some of the residuals and understand if there was a spatial pattern to those. And could that spatial pattern be compared with GIA or other drivers of vertical land motion across Australia? And so I did this via, I guess, a straight one-to-one comparison initially. Could we compare the velocities out of the AuScope network to some of the velocities from models of modern day GIA? So I took a few different models, and in essence, I didn't get a great match, and that was curious. And there wasn't even a great match between the different GIA models across Australia, and so that was even more curious again. And so this kind of prompted a bit of further digging into why there were such differences between the different GIA models, and then why we weren't seeing, I guess, a large contribution to the vertical signal. Where this got to was then leading to, I guess, some signal decomposition using both principal and independent component analysis. So this is entering into the spatial domain, where the AuScope network is well suited to that, being a fairly dense and fairly well spatially distributed network. So PCA is the idea that you take the time series and you can break it into components with the restriction that those components must be orthogonal to each other. Independent components doesn't set that constraint, where the next modes in the analysis don't necessarily have to be orthogonal. And so I wanted to understand if there were differences between those in terms of the spatial patterning across Australia. And what we found was that the leading mode, or the first, I guess, the first dominant pattern of motion across Australia, was that there is a clear signal all in the same direction. So there was a dominant pattern of motion across Australia that was all the one direction. It wasn't the same magnitude everywhere, so we did see some spatial tilt, which we expected, or some continental tilt. But what was also curious was during that component analysis, where further down the different modes of motion, we're able to match some of those patterns with climatic effects such as the El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO, and also the Indian Ocean Dipole. So those are, I guess, mass pulses or mass movements that then affect the continental motion at seasonal timescales. And so that was interesting that we hadn't seen that before in terms of a crustal deformation over the Australian plate. And so in essence, it is possible to understand large scale crustal deformation from this network across Australia, but that we did see substantial differences between the observed vertical land motion and the predicted vertical land motion around GIA. And that the velocities from GNSS better reflect the long-term motion after spatial temporal filtering and modelling of those short-term geophysical effects. But there's still some unexplained surface motion going on in the GNSS signal that couldn't fully be explained by GIA, which was to be expected, noting that the GIA signal over Australia is small. So what else can we take a look at that explains some of the vertical land motion across Australia? The next spot I wanted to investigate was trying to understand if some of that motion could be attributed to earthquakes, whether that's co-seismic deformation, the instantaneous change after an earthquake, or post-seismic deformation, noting that they represent a driver of spatially coherent motion, and that this hadn't previously been looked at across Australia. So there are quite a few large earthquakes that have happened in recent history around the plate boundary around Australia. It's a few more than 24 now. This figure is slightly outdated, particularly noting that we've had some other larger earthquakes in our region. But the idea that the release of energy after an earthquake can cause an instantaneous response, being the co-seismic, but then also a slow relaxation, and that can happen over 1 to 5 to 10 years of crustal deformation and that slow change. And so this has previously been looked at in a global context in terms of the horizontal deformation, and this is some work by Paul Tregoning and partners, looking at the co-seismic and post-seismic deformation of large events globally, and the pockets of deformation that result from those. And I guess the large earthquakes in our region that we're particularly interested, noting that Australia kind of sits in this zone of minimal deformation. Focusing on the vertical, we're looking at Macquarie Island, which is down to the southeast, and then some Sumatra Andaman earthquakes up to the northeast, and then also some larger earthquakes up to the northwest as well. And so these are large spatial scales, so it's over 1,000 kilometres. Some of these earthquakes have happened away from continental Australia, and so the question was, can we actually observe those in some of the GPS time series? So this is where we're getting down to that millimetre matters question. And there's also been a recent assumption that Southeast Australia, or the Australian continent in general, sits on that rigid plate. But what we're starting to see is that if this rigid plate theory were to hold true, that the deformation at each of these sites would be similar, and that there wouldn't be a spatial degradation the further away you got from the earthquake. And that's not what we see. So we do see, so this is looking at the Macquarie Island earthquake that happened late in 2004 at different sites across Australia in Hobart, Melbourne and Canberra. So Hobart being the closest site to that Macquarie Island earthquake, which shows the strongest signal. We move further north to Melbourne and that signal becomes slightly less. And then we move further north again to Canberra and that signal becomes slightly less again. And so this is suggesting that the Australian plate is not behaving as a rigid body, which is a little contrary to the existing wisdom that we first believed. And so the work that I did was to start taking a look at those GNSS series, again, breaking them down, and also comparing the observations or using the observations to constrain some modelling of post-seismic and co-seismic deformation across the Australian plate. And so it was using this entire network again, taking regional chunks to see if we could understand and see some of the deformation that's happening across Australia. And so this was focusing again on the linear and the non-linear components of those deformation signals. So not just fitting a straight line and assuming that that is a long-term trend, trying to understand that post-seismic relaxation, which is technically, or traditionally, sorry, a non-linear shape in terms of its relaxation motion. Plastic rather than elastic, I guess, is the way to think about it. And so the regions that I focused on, or the earthquakes that I focused on, were those 3 large earthquakes down to the south. So these are all larger than magnitude 7.5. And the expectation is that it caused some very small deformation across the Australian plate. And I wanted to compare the modelled deformation with the observed deformation. And so to do the co-seismic modelling, I used static 1D, which is a simple 1D laid earth. You put in the geometry and the parameters of the earthquake, and that provides an estimate of the co-seismic offset that you might see at those sites. And then I was estimating the offset observed in the time series and comparing those two. Once, if they were a good match, I was then using the GNSS to constrain the post-seismic model, which is again a 1D laid earth. So I used Visco 1D in a Maxwell-Berger rheology. So this is providing different viscosities and thicknesses for the different layers of the earth as an earth profile, and again fitting those GNSS observed offsets as part of the constraint for the post-seismic relaxation. And in general, the comparison of the observations and the model were fairly spot on. And so here we've got a few different panels. The sites are across the top. We've got Stromlo, which is in Canberra, and also Tidbinbilla, which is fairly nearby, and then Hobart being Hob2 for the northeast and up components, where the black dots and the blue lines are the GNSS observations at those sites, where the signal has been detrended relative to the time period prior to the earthquake, so that we're able to see the post-seismic change quite clearly. And then the different coloured lines are the deformation models as predicted by Visco 1D, with different earth rheologies, trying to work out if changing the viscosity and the thickness of those earth layers, we can kind of land on a better fit for that observed post-seismic deformation. Generally, the horizontal components fit quite well, but the vertical component was generally underestimated in terms of the post-seismic modelled deformation. And so this was suggesting that perhaps a 1D laid earth wasn't particularly great for estimating the vertical deformation from earthquakes across Australia. And so this is, this was specifically for the Macquarie Island earthquake, just demonstrating the technique and the observations. Again, this is these are for the Sumatran events. So there were 4 events, the Banda Aceh Boxing Day tsunami event in 2004, another one in March 2005, and then a few other larger earthquakes in 2007 and 2012. And so very complicated region, and I combined the models to get an overall understanding of the deformation that might be coming from that northwest region, northwest of the Australian plate, where I've got sites here at Karratha, Yarragadee on the Western Australian coast, and also up north in Darwin at the Northern Territory. And again, the vertical components were not fitting particularly well. So again, suggesting that a 1D laid earth model for post-seismic modelling in Australia is perhaps not great. And so some improvements could be made there by using a 3D model, where we're starting to account for some spatial variability in the modelling, the earth layering across Australia, noting that it's a fairly old, large continent that has different blocks of continental structure and geological structure. And so the key points from that chunk of work were that we do see some far field, some deformation caused by far field earthquakes, and that can be observed in the GNSS time series, and that we get some subsidence reaching that 4 to 5 millimeter per year at the peak over several years, which was most notable following some of the Sumatran earthquake series. And that, again, that 1D viscoelastic earth model is perhaps not great for vertical, for understanding the vertical predicted motion from those earthquakes across Australia. So we're doing a little bit more work looking into some laterally varying models. And that there were also some other offsets, as in co-seismic deformation offsets, that I identified that weren't necessarily in the public record. And so they're also available as additional offsets that could be included in people's time series for if they're considering putting those into the reference frame in future. And so this leads me to kind of where to next. What are the other chunks of work that we're doing at Geoscience Australia to bring this all together and to actually put it into practice? So we are putting together some national scale deformation maps that will lead into our plate motion models to allow us to get between our static and our time dependent datums. And we're doing this through a combination of INSAR to create national deformation maps, and also our APREF processing, and then also I guess the combination of all of these to come up with the deformation maps. And so our INSAR processing is using some in-house software that was developed at GA called Pyrate, and we're using the Sentinel-1 SAR series. So it's a little sad that 1B has gone down, because we do rely on that as part of our pipeline for putting the data together to come up with these national deformation maps. And so generally the process is that we download the data, we create some analysis ready data using some gamma interferometry software, and then we calculate some displacement time series and velocity trends as well for each frame of the data using Pyrate. And so we come up with some pretty tidy data stacks, ground surface velocity maps, and then also time series of displacements for each pixel, which is a pretty neat solution. We haven't expanded this out to be a full continental scale deformation map yet, but we're getting pretty close. We're working on chunks at a time and testing as we go. But some of the applications that this has been put into practice for across Australia are nuclear testband treaty monitoring, urban monitoring across metro areas. We've been tasked to look at subsidence due to mining, and also whether dams are experiencing collapse or bulging. And this has actually been a fascinating case study in the combination of different geodetic techniques, which can detect displacements at that millimetric level. And SAR applications are a really nice complement to GNSS, noting that they can pick up horizontal deformations as well as vertical deformations once you account for the line of sight change. And it also provides a fairly cost-effective way to monitor and detect surface change, rather than relying on a point source, which, like GNSS, you get a far better spatial coverage that you can then infill with some point data. And so we are coming up with these large, tidy, continental scale deformation maps, and that's the plan for the future moving forward. And this will improve our Australian geospatial reference system in terms of building a deformation model into the plate motion model to get between GDA 2020 and ATRF 2014, which will be updated to ATRF 2020 once we get a handle on the release of ITRF 2020. And so with that, I think I'd like to start wrapping up, and thank you for listening and paying attention. In essence, my PhD research focused on understanding the uncertainty in the geocenter and how that propagates through to GNSS coordinate estimates. I then took that a little bit further to try and understand what the vertical land motion of Australia and the continental change looks like from GNSS, and whether we could compare that vertical observation to GIA model predictions, and then also trying to understand if there's any post-seismic deformation from far-field earthquakes in our area and how that feeds into our national scale deformation maps, and that this is possible and it's coming. So thank you very much. Hopefully that hasn't been too fast of a fly through. It's been enjoyable to talk about my work and the work that we're doing at GA.
Thanks, Anna. That was a really amazing and comprehensive presentation. I really appreciate, and as well as the participants, all the effort that you're doing. Are there any questions from the audience at this moment? And Bill, I believe the floor is yours.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
Great. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I was curious about the effect of the earthquakes. Australia seems almost completely surrounded by subduction zones, and I think you showed that they really can perhaps cause subsidence in Australia. I'm wondering if you take the integrated effect of all of those earthquakes over time, not just the most recent ones, which of course we know about, but there are a sequence of events that go back in time. If the cumulative effect of those, can they really cause the whole Australian landmass to subside, sort of evenly, like the vertical GPS measurements show?
Yeah, and so I think that's something that we didn't get to, I guess. I ran out of time and patience. And so that would be one of the next steps, would be to look at the cumulative effect of all of those earthquakes combined. And I suspect that you'd actually see some cross earthquake interference, I guess, of the motion, particularly noting that the earthquakes in the New Zealand region are transform faults, and then but then up to the north you've got the subduction, and it gets very complicated because it's shifting, bending, buckling, breaking, and in essence we originally thought that there'd be a bulge in the middle from the stress, but what we actually saw was that it's a kind of a constant depression with a slight tilt towards the north. And that's not just to do with earthquake post-seismic, it's also hydrologic signals as well, that you see a seasonal, there's a great paper by Xin-Chan Han that it calls it a seasonal gyration due to the mass in the north during the wet season, and then as that releases you get that tilt back towards the south again. But yeah, so it would be fascinating to understand the whole picture effect of those earthquakes over time. And if you can go back further in time, I know that Christopher Watson specifically focused on the 2004 Macquarie Island earthquake, but there was also one back in the 70s as well that he kind of tried to back predict. And if we could do that for some of the others, that would be interesting too.
Thank you. I could ask another one if
Yeah.
But I'll wait to be called on.
You can go ahead, unless there are any other questions from the audience. I don't see any raised hands.
Okay. Those zones of seismicity in the south are, I didn't do my homework, so I didn't look to see if there are any strain rate maps, or if there is there any horizontal strain associated with those zones of seismicity? Has any strain been detected?
There are, that's slightly outside my area, but I know that there's a group at ANU that specifically are looking at those strain rates. I think they're very small, and we do have I guess a denser network of sites in those areas. I didn't include them in my processing because they were not of the concrete pillar designs and the time series aren't as long, but we do have additional, I guess, seismic and GNSS networks in those areas that there are other groups working on, particularly around trying to understand those seismic zones, because there are three very distinct areas that we know cause smaller earthquakes, but then we see those, the little chatters come through. So I think there definitely are some strain rates. I didn't build those into my research.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Anna. There's one question in the chat, so I'm going to read it out loud. Thank you for giving this talk. Nice talk. It's 3 a.m. in Saudi Arabia and my roommates are sleeping, so I can use the microphone. We've been there, we understand. I have one question. Have you found long wavelength patterns in the vertical deformation, which is diagnostic of mantle processes? Long-term mantle flow has been modulating the topography of Australia. The southern part advanced towards the sea, while the northern part retreated away from the sea. The coastal region subsided. Can you see fingerprints of such mantle process?
Yeah, so that's going a lot deeper than I originally wanted to. I really wanted to focus on the surface crustal deformation. So in terms of long waveform or long wavelength mantle changes, that's a little beyond me. I know, again, that there have been some investigations into particularly mantle plumes that underlie the Australian continent. So no, I didn't see those, but I think there has been some research done on that.
Thanks a lot. Are there any other questions or comments? If not, I just want to say thank you to everyone that joined us. Thank you, Anna, for such an amazing presentation. And hopefully we will make this presentation available online as well. So I wish you the best wherever you are around the world, and take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.